So here's where we're going to start to get into the, kind of talking about the various hormones that are released from the pituitary gland, right? One thing, and I hadn't mentioned yet, is something else that the anterior pituitary can be called is something called the adenohypophysis, right? So I had mentioned how the pituitary in general can be called the hypophysis, but specifically the anterior lobe can also be called the adeno. Adeno pertaining to gland, and the reason why is the anterior pituitary both produces and secretes the hormone as opposed to the posterior pituitary, which merely secretes them or stores and secretes them. The posterior pituitary can also be called something called the neurohypophysis. So this first hormone we're going to look at regarding the anterior pituitary is something called growth hormone. You'll see it's also something that can be called somatotropin. Choice is yours, which one you want to call it. They're both correct, right? We can see this is released in, excuse me, released in bursts throughout the day. Largest amounts are when we sleep. Even people who are, or those that are young, kind of going through puberty. That's the reason why, you know, uh, whatever. That's the reason why you can go months without seeing a younger relative or whatever, a niece or a nephew, for instance. And over just a few months, when you see them, you're like, oh my God, they've grown 4 inches. That's because they have pretty sizable release of growth hormone at that age. And you can see the actual stimulation of growth hormone release is when the hypothalamus, again here, the hypothalamus releases something called growth hormone releasing hormone. And then remember, the hypothalamus, when it produces these hormones, it dumps them directly into the bloodstream. Right? We had just covered on the previous video at the very end the hypophyseal portal system. That's where the hormone gets dumped into the bloodstream, and then that hormone travels downstream, and the next thing it runs into is the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary. So those growth hormone releasing hormones come into contact with the receptors on the somatotrophs. Somatotrophs is just a fancy name for cells which produce growth hormone or cells which produce somatotropin. Right. So remember, certain target cells, target cells have a receptor for a particular hormone. So these somatotrophs, or these growth hormone producing cells, have a receptor for growth hormone releasing hormone. And as soon as that's present, those cells begin to produce growth hormone. So you can see right now those cells begin to pump out growth hormone. You can see right here. Now, a couple of things we'll kind of go this route just because it's a little more we're all familiar with kind of this route. We see as far as skeletal, extraskeletal. Yeah, growth hormone eventually is going to stimulate skeletal growth, right? That's the reason why. I mean, there are pretty commonly many accounts of, even both men, boys and girls, particularly young boys, where they may grow upwards of half of an inch over a 24-hour period, right? That's a huge amount of growth. That growth is being stimulated by growth hormone, right? Even throughout, our life after puberty, right? In our 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. Growth hormone is something that's always going to be present. However, nowhere near the quantity it is in puberty and earlier in life. This is one of the reasons why, it's been a number of years, but growth hormone, I don't want to say supplementation, but back in the mid to late 90s, as far as especially in Major League Baseball, growth hormone was a pretty significant problem, right? Because of the fact that certain athletes were taking shots of growth hormone. By shots, I mean, like an injection. Anyways, injections of growth hormone, and that was stimulating massive amounts of tissue growth. But that's why you had guys going, that's funny. Last season they weighed 200 pounds, and this season they're weighing 260 pounds, right? That amount of growth is not exactly feasible without some sort of outside help. And we can see, right, tissue growth, cell differentiation, augmentation of tropic hormones. Yeah, Growth hormone, again, stimulates, I mean, not just skeleton, but tissues from skeletal muscle, even certain organs, allows cells to differentiate, right? Meaning it allows those kind of precursor cells, or those quote unquote, those immature cells to become that mature adult cell. Now here, right, we kind of take the other, right, the other path, right? We see direct anti-insulin effects. We see growth hormone, right? This is going to increase something called lipolysis, right? This lipolysis, lipids or fat, lysis, breakdown. Oh, it's going to increase the generation of fat breakdown, right? And now we see also increased gluconeogenesis. Well, yeah, remember, if the entire purpose to growth hormone is to increase tissue synthesis, it's to increase the growth of these tissues. Does that require energy? You betcha, right? It requires buku amounts of it. So if that's the case, if synthesizing and producing all these tissues requires energy, that's one of the things that growth hormone in conjunction with cortisol, that's something that's going to stimulate is the breakdown of fats, because fats are a major energy reserve in the body. So that's something else growth hormone can help to, stimulate. The next hormone we're going to look at, right, anterior pituitary, thyroid stimulating hormone, something called thyrotropin. So thyroid stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary in response to something called thyrotropin releasing hormone, which we see right here, TRH. Thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, right? Once it's released, that thyrotropin releasing hormone then travels to the anterior pituitary via the hypophyseal portal system. Thyrotropin releasing hormone comes into contact with these cells called thyrotropes, which are the cells which produce thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone is then released, and that travels all the way down to the thyroid gland. And again, those target cells, those follicular cells, have a receptor for thyroid stimulating hormone. Once they come into contact with thyroid stimulating hormone, they then release thyroid hormone. And there's several different forms of thyroid hormone. There's something called thyroxine, which is T4, and there's triiodothyronine, which is T3. The bulk of what's released is T4, or it's thyroxine. This is inactive, right? Thyroid hormone is going to achieve many things, right? In youth, in young, right? When you have inadequate release of thyroid hormone, something called cretinism develops. Thyroid hormone's contribution, right? It's many things. One of the things in development has to do with basically kind of ensuring skeletal proportions, right? Whereas growth hormone allows for the growth of the skeleton, for instance. All right, what regulates to make sure that our forearm is about, twice the length of our hand? What makes sure that our thigh or our femur is, another 50, is a little bit longer than the humerus? What ensures that the foot is the length that it is in conjunction with the leg, right? Those portions, that's what's achieved through the thyroid hormone. Now, at the bottom, we see peripheral tissues convert T4 into T3. One of the other things that thyroid hormone can do is it can help stimulate oxidative phosphorylation, or it can stimulate energy production. Right? At certain times, certain tissues require greater levels of energy. Right? One of the ways they can help to regulate that is by the presence of thyroid hormone. If T4 or thyroxine, for instance, right, is, I remember, target cells have a receptor. So let's say I'm a skeletal muscle cell. Right? If thyroxine, which is the inactive form of thyroid hormone, comes into contact with me, nothing happens. Right? Thyroxine's inactive. I could not care any less about it. However, if I'm a muscle cell and I, for some reason, need to have elevated levels of energy, I can then actually convert that T4 into T3. And then once it's active, if that same thyroid hormone comes into contact with the receptor, now it actually activates, right, that particular receptor. Right, so thyroid hormone is important enough where it needs to be coursing through the bloodstream, and the peripheral tissues need to be able to uh, convert it if need be. So this here I just mentioned, right, major regulator of metabolism and body temperature, right? That's one of the things where people talk about, oh, I've got a hypoactive thyroid or hyperactive thyroid. And one thing about, generally those people who have a hyperactive thyroid are kind of a, thinner, leaner build, whereas someone who is hypothyroid or somebody who has a hypoactive thyroid are generally, have an increased level of adipose tissue. And the reason why, our thyroid gland, we see a major regulator of metabolism, and that's through its ability to regulate oxidative phosphorylation. That's just the fancy name meaning ATP production, right? There's different ways our cells can produce ATP, right? That energy of the cell. Oxidative phosphorylation is the main or the bulk of how ATP is produced. The other thing that thyroid hormone is going to do is it helps to regulate blood flowing to the dermis. Right? Remember the dermis, that's the bottom portion or the second the layer beneath the epidermis. So that's one of the things, right? If you kind of think about it, if thyroid hormone helps to elevate oxidative phosphorylation, if we have increased energy demands, that means we have, well, if we have increased energy demands, that means we're going to what's the word? If we have increased energy demands, we are going to start to burn more energy, right? The reason why we're producing more energy is because we need to burn more energy. So if that's the case, what happens when we exercise or when we, whatever, taking an exam, we start to sweat, right? If we're exercising, we utilize more energy, right? One of the byproducts of energy utilization is heat production. So we have to get rid of that heat, so we start to sweat. So the main way that our body has to regulate body temperature is through the amount of blood flowing through the skin, right? That's why during exercise, if you look, most people, their faces or their skin gets very, beet red. My daughter's face, good God, she turns into a crab when she does anything physically active, right? She just turns very red, right? And that's okay, right? That's how her body's actually getting rid of all this excess heat. Now, with thyroid gland, you see, functions alongside growth hormone and insulin to ensure proper growth. Yeah, as I mentioned, right, growth hormone, that functions to actually synthesize the tissue, whereas thyroid hormone allows for the proportion of that tissue to be intact. Releases in calcitonin, right, or it releases calcitonin. There's a hormone called calcitonin. This is going to function to help regulate blood calcium levels. Think of calcitonin in the bonin, right? So calcitonin is going to stimulate calcium to enter into the bone. So if that happens, right, calcitonin enters into the bone, that means calcitonin is going to lower blood calcium levels. So the next hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone, right, or something called corticotropin. It stimulates the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, primary role, glucose metabolism, and decreasing immune function. Yeah, right, ACTH, right, this here, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. The primary, glucocorticoid that is released is something called cortisol. Right here, something called cortisol. Now, cortisol is, we've kind of all talked about it or we've heard about it, something called the stress hormone, right? It doesn't cause stress, it's released in response to stress. And it kind of makes sense because cortisol does a couple different things. One, it helps to regulate glucose metabolism, right? It helps to mobilize glucose stores, right? It also helps to produce glucose through something called gluconeogenesis, primarily of amino acids. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But something else cortisol will do, we see it decreases immune function. There's other glucocorticoids, right, that you've heard of, right? If you've ever heard of somebody who's had, cortisone injections or hydrocortisone, your body makes this stuff, right? This stuff is super anti-inflammatory. If you've ever known anybody to get sprain an ankle, have golfer's elbow, one of the options is they may get injections of hydrocortisone. And the reason why is it's a potent anti-inflammatory, so it helps to reduce the inflammation in the area. Now, there's problems with that, right? That's one of the things about hydrocortisone in that level is it actually shows to increase the breakdown of the localized tissues, because that's obviously getting a straight injection of hydrocortisone is much, much different than your body actually producing it. But a little bit later on, we're going to look at cortisol and its relation in the stress response, the acute stress, the long-term stress, and one of the issues which can arise from long-term release of cortisol. Right, cortisol is not a bad guy, right? It's just like chocolate cake. One piece of chocolate, a little bit of chocolate cake is fantastic. A little bit more, okay, it's still fine. It's when we eat the entire chocolate cake that's a problem. Although currently under quarantine, not quarantine, but whatever, house arrest, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, the idea of eating a whole chocolate cake actually sounds like a fantastic idea. So, anyways, the next gland, or not the next gland, but the next kind of part of the adrenal gland that we're going to talk about. The adrenal gland does not only release cortisol, right? There's several different areas and regions in which that are throughout the adrenal gland. We see something called the zona glomerulosa, right? Now let me back up. There's two regions of the adrenal gland, right? Think of whatever, an apple, right? There's the core of the apple, which would be something called the medulla. That's this guy. And then the entire part of the apple, which you would actually eat, that's the cortex. Right? And that outer part of the apple that you would eat, there's three different layers: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Of the zona glomerulosa, we see it secretes mineralocorticoids, which help regulate fluid volume. We're going to look at here in a slide or two something called aldosterone. Right? Aldosterone is a hormone which is released from the zona glomerulosa. It's an antidiuretic, which means it's going to allow your body to retain more fluid. We're going to look at the whole pathway here in a second. Before we do, the zona fasciculata, we see secretes glucocorticoids. Oh, this is the actual layer which is going to release the cortisol. Right here. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, right? Whereas some hormones, right, thyroid, certain hormones are only released in response to a particular hormone. So, for instance, one of the ways cortisol is released is by the presence of adrenocorticotropic hormone. There are other methods by which can stimulate cortisol release. That's how important cortisol is, right? Adipocyte-derived factors, meaning, certain molecules that fat cells are going to produce, certain molecules that endothelial cells produce, immune cells, neurons, right? There are many different methods by which cortisol can actually be released, not only through adrenocorticotropic hormone. All right, continuing back with the adrenal. Something called the zona reticularis. We see this secretes androgens. They're weak androgens. They're sex hormones, right? Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, right? This is why, women, menopausal women, right? They don't entirely stop the release of estrogen. However, they produce significantly less estrogen than they did in their 20s and 30s, right? Before menopause. Right, because one of the things that happens is the zona reticularis can actually produce estrogen. Again, it's a much smaller amount of estrogen, right? But it can still produce it. The medulla itself, we see, secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. The medulla, right? The medulla of the adrenal gland is not controlled by the adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? That's not what stimulates the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. This is under sympathetic control of the brain. Right now, sure, that can also affect the the brain can also cause the release of aldosterone, these androgens, cortisol. However, sympathetic neurons themselves stimulate the adrenal medulla. Right. This is part of the reason why, for instance, very commonly, people with blood sugar issues. Right. Let's say my wife's grandfather. Before he went to bed, he used to every night he'd have a big bowl of chocolate ice cream. Right. He was a diabetic. Right. He'd have a bowl of ice cream and he'd go to bed. And two things: even someone who's not diabetic, it's a terrible idea. But two, he wasn't diabetic, relatively uncontrolled, didn't care, and he'd have a bowl of ice cream and go to bed. He'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning, and he would just be, sweating, shaking, right? He would then pop a Hershey Kiss and go back to bed. Now, for those of you who are in healthcare or have heard this, you're like, oh yeah, that's like super typical, and that is very typical. People are like, yeah, I'll just pop a Hershey Kiss or have a Werther's Original or whatever, something like that to get blood sugar back up, which is a terrible idea. My whole point is when our body needs I'm talking a very kind of quick release of of blood glucose. Right, if blood glucose levels are dropping, we can release epinephrine to help elevate blood glucose levels, helps mobilize some of those energy stores. The thing is, when we're asleep, that's something that can't actually happen. When we are asleep, we are not able to stimulate the adrenal medulla because it requires sympathetic activation, which when we're asleep can't happen. So what happens is our body then wakes us up because our blood sugar is dropping too low. We then wake up. Well, when we wake up, our body can then stimulate that adrenal medulla to release that epinephrine. So that's in part of what's going on. So we dive a little bit deeper into the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway. Sorry, I forgot how to read there for a minute. We see, right, aldosterone. This was the hormone which was released from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal gland. We see dehydration, sodium deficiency, hemorrhage. Yeah, if we are losing blood volume, if we are not intaking enough fluid, that means our blood volume is too low. So if our blood volume gets too low, I know you haven't covered cardiovascular yet, it's 122, but if our blood volume drops, our blood pressure drops along with it, right? Which, again, if it drops too low, that's a problem. So the kidney can produce something called renin. The same token, the liver produces something called angiotensinogen. When angiotensinogen and renin combine, they make a baby called angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1, through a hormone called angiotensin converting enzyme, becomes angiotensin 2. That ACE, right, the ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, that is derived from the liver. Derived from the lungs, excuse me. If you've ever heard of an ACE inhibitor, right, utilized for blood pressure regulation. An ACE inhibitor, again, inhibits this conversion. So therefore, with an ACE inhibitor, right, if we have an ACE inhibitor, that means, okay, so ACE isn't produced or isn't, is produced in less quantities. If it's produced in less quantities, that means none of this here, right, the whole rest of this doesn't take place, right, if someone's on an ACE inhibitor. So with angiotensin 1 and with the presence of angiotensin converting enzyme, we then produce angiotensin 2. Now, the angiotensin 2, this is where you actually then start to have an impact on blood pressure at this level here. So angiotensin 2 is going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to stimulate the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And secondly, it's going to vasoconstrict arterioles. Arterioles are, think of them as being small little arteries, right? Think of a tree, right? There's the big branches on a tree, which are the arteries, and then there's the smaller branches. Those are the arterioles. Right, so when we constrict the arterioles, again, we have now covered cardiovascular, but when we constrict the tube that fluid flows through, you increase the pressure inside of that tube. So if we increase or if we constrict the size of the vessel, meaning make it smaller, right, that increases the pressure. Therefore, well, our problem initially was blood pressure was decreasing. If we need to increase it, that's one of the ways we could do so. We could constrict the arterioles. Secondly, if we increase the volume, right? If we increase the volume of fluid inside of the blood vessel, we there in turn increase blood volume, and that also increases blood pressure. So the zona reticularis with the releases weak androgens and primarily something called DHEA. Right, you can look it up. It's 15 letters, and yeah, right now, yep, DHEA is good enough for me. DHEA. Right. Now we can see DHEA. Right. This is what can give rise to the various androgens, right, or the various weak sex hormones: testosterone, estradiol, estrone, estriol. These are all just different forms of estrogen. These here, but we can see, regardless of what they are, right? DHEA, testosterone, estrogen, right? Even cortisol, even aldosterone, they all stem from they all stem from cholesterol. So let's just hypothetically say, oh, I have no cholesterol in the body. If you had zero cholesterol, you wouldn't be able to make aldosterone, you wouldn't be able to make cortisol, and you wouldn't be able to make these different sex hormones. Obviously, we do have cholesterol, but I'm saying hypothetically, if we didn't, you wouldn't have the presence of these different hormones. One of the things with DHEA, people commonly supplement with DHEA, right? Supposedly, it helps reduce adipose tissue, right? Helps increase testosterone levels, right? Oh, DHEA, that's a precursor to testosterone. So if I take more DHEA, that means I must make more testosterone. Okay, correct, kind of in part. One of the things with, generally those people who take DHEA, especially for like weight loss or to build testosterone, are obese men, right? Obese men have increased levels of adipose tissue. If they have increased levels of adipose tissue, that means they're going to have an increased level of something called aromatase, which is an enzyme which is going to increase the amount of estrogen which is produced. So essentially, if you're an obese male, right, I would definitely not recommend supplementing with DHEA, because with the DHEA, along with the adipose tissue, you're actually going to produce higher levels of estrogen as opposed to testosterone. Makes sense? So, looking at the stress response, right? Talking about the stress response, the adrenal hormone. When we talk about the adrenal influences on stress response, the short-term stress response, right? We can see here. This is, right, heart rate. Somebody scares the bejesus out of you, right? Heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, bronchioles dilate. Yeah, those tubes, those small airway tubes, right? Liver converts glycogen to glucose. Yeah, meaning your liver converts more stored energy into available energy. Right? Blood flow changes, reduces digestive system activity and urine output, metabolic rate increases. Yeah, all those things, if somebody scares the crap out of you, that's what happens. The problem is over the long term, right? If we reduce digestive system activity and urine output, well, urine output, that's one of the ways that our body can regulate volume levels, right? If we urinate, right? If I drink a gallon of water, I'm going to urinate more. Why? Because the volume of water I'm intaking significantly outpaces and outweighs the amount of water or volume that my body needs. So I'm going to produce more urine, get rid of that excess volume. If I have elevated levels of, cortisol, elevated levels of these catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, for instance, elevated levels of cortisol, that's going to that's going to cause the body to retain more volume, right? Because urine output's reduced. Right, so blood volume is going to elevate. That leads to higher blood pressure. All right. Something else that's going to happen is we start to have the increased release of aldosterone. With elevated release of aldosterone, well, aldosterone retains sodium, and because water is a follower, if we retain sodium, we're going to retain water. So our blood pressure goes up more so. Proteins, fats, right? With cortisol is something that is going to stimulate gluconeogenesis. That's the production of essentially new glucose molecules, specifically from amino acids. So with elevated levels of cortisol, we're going to cause the conversion of amino acids into glucose. Again, that's a problem, right? Amino acids, there are from hormones to neurotransmitters to muscle tissue. There is a number of different tissues which all require proteins. So blood glucose levels elevate. Well, now you can just think of kind of the whole cascade of that. If blood glucose levels are always chronically elevated, that means insulin levels have to elevate correspondingly. So if we're super stressed, prolonged stress, that's going to cause insulin levels to be elevated. If my diet's horrible, I just wolfed down a double cheeseburger and some French fries, that's also going to cause my insulin levels to elevate. So you can see how having a poor diet along with being stressed is just setting somebody up for insulin resistance later on. Now, also remember, we see immune system suppression, right? That's something else that we see with long-term stress, is because of that increase or that prolonged release of cortisol, that also is going to suppress the immune system. So the last couple hormones from the anterior pituitary that we're going to look at, one is melanocyte stimulating hormone. We see increased production of melanin. We see this increases the protection against UV radiation. Right? We see this is responsible for increased pigmentation, and we say during pregnancy it's responsible for increased pigmentation at any point, but particularly during pregnancy. Right? That's one of the things about you go out in the sun more so, you develop a tan. Right, that tan develops because of the increased production of melanin. Right, during pregnancy, right, radiation is something which is potentially harmful for Junior. So one of the ways to protect Junior from that radiation is to make your skin a few pigments darker. The other hormones, these next three, we're really not going to cover. Really not going to cover a whole lot here, because in the reproductive chapter, that's where we would cover them, pretty significantly. Again, that's prolactin, that's FSH, that's LH. All of these can be we will talk about in the reproductive chapter.